You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
This was an election that certainly everyone knew was coming at some point. Minority governments are not particularly stable. I think the question was more of one about when rather than if. But if you had to characterize the election themes where we are now, I know a lot of people thought it was going to be a pandemic election, but now we have this Afghanistan crisis. When you're knocking on the doors, what is the election actually about to people?
Well, people are trying to figure that out because Trudeau caused this election to occur, and his campaign has been a Seinfeld campaign, a campaign about nothing. People are sort of waiting. You called this election. Do you have something to tell us? Do you have a big agenda that you have to ask our support for? And the answer is no. He has absolutely nothing new to say. He simply called the election in retrospect because he thought he could get away with securing a majority while in the immediate aftermath of spending $500 billion while people were still afraid of COVID. So I joked earlier today, his slogan should have been quick, no one's looking. Because I think that's how he thought this would go. He'd just call a snap election, partly in the middle of the summer, partly while farmers are out at getting ready for harvest, and that people just wouldn't have any time to think or scrutinize and would accidentally secure his majority mandate. And it's not turning out that way at all. There's been a massive backlash against him for calling this election. And then not only that, this is the worst run election campaign the Liberals have ever done. He's gone from the wonder boy to the blunder boy. Every day it seems there's a gaffe, whether it was Liberals saying that the Taliban are their brothers, or Trudeau admitting he doesn't know anything about monetary policy now when we have among the highest inflation in decades and people can't afford to buy a home. Or this recent gaffe where they are now saying, admitting for the first time that what we knew all along, which is that they're going to tax gains on primary residences. These are massive gaffes, any one of which should cost him the election.
We've seen this government skate through a lot of pretty difficult things without really being challenged on it. You look at SNC-Lavalin, and they followed that by a victory in 2019. Sure, coming down to a minority. The WE scandal as well had legs for a while, as we say, but then the government prorogued Parliament, and it seemed like a lot of the scrutiny on that went away. And I remember, as a lot of Canadians do, that press conference where you were showing all of these documents that the government had redacted, and still I haven't heard WE brought up a single day on this campaign. What do you think needs to be done to get Canadians, and by extension, I guess, the media, to care about these things?
Well, the mainstream media will never care about any of them because they almost unanimously support Trudeau and want to see him reelected. Of course, he bought them off with the $500 million media fund. But let's not forget, though, the Conservatives won more votes than the Liberals in the last election. He got the lowest share of the votes of any prime minister to be reelected in Canadian history. So it's not as though he's a particularly popular prime minister. You'd think he was if you just watched the CBC National. But if you look at the data, he's actually quite an unpopular prime minister who's been very lucky about the distribution of vote that has allowed him to preserve power with a very small, but less than a third of voters backing him.
So let's talk a little bit about what the Conservative answer to that corruption allegation is, because I know the platform this year has some stuff to crack down and give a lot of these conflict of interest and ethics violations that are found to have happened to a bit more teeth in the response to them. But how can you really combat that in practice? Because, I mean, in general, there's, I think, a malaise and a distrust of politicians, but what could a Conservative government do better that would make it so these things don't happen with impunity?
For one, there has to be more consequences for guilty findings, particularly compounded and serious guilty findings for politicians violating the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Act. Secondly, I think we have to toughen up the whistleblower protection so that it's easier for people to speak out when they see corruption. But third, I think the people of Canada have to exercise accountability at the ballot box. Ultimately, that's the way our system works. We have a system of democratic accountability more than bureaucratic rules. It is one thing to have public authority like the ethics commissioner examine behavior and then compare it to a law and issue a finding, but it's not quite another for the voters to say they've had enough and throw the guy out. And I think that's the ultimate accountability that we can show on Election Day.
Let's talk about the financial situation here. We've all seen that PBO report that says we're on track to run up deficits for the next 50 years.
Right.
And at that point, it doesn't even become relevant because it's just so many billions and trillions of dollars of debt and debt service payment and all of that. Realistically, how is a fiscally conservative approach even possible when you're coming in, if a conservative government's elected, with that much baggage? I know your platform is to balance within 10 years, but practically, how does that actually happen when things are as dire as they are now?
Right. Well, good question. I mean, first of all, I don't think it's just practical. I think it's going to be unavoidable. The current deficit is driving inflation. Whenever you create crash, you inflate the price of things. And the government has created $400 billion of M2 money supply, which is to say coins, bills, and bank deposits in just over a year, which is the biggest increase in money supply ever. In percentage terms, it's the biggest since 1974. And we remember what happened in the late 70s. We had hyperinflation in the double digits. Followed by massive interest rate hikes to nearly 20%. That is, we don't know exactly what the future will bring, but we know that the history of money printing has been a runaway inflation. So whoever forms government is going to have to rein that in unless we want to continue to see out of control price increases that destroy the middle class, drive the poor deeper into poverty, and inflate the wealth of the super rich. I think we probably, when we look back on this and the data comes out, we'll see that this money printing binge the government is on will lead to probably the biggest expansion of the wealth gap in Canadian history. As wealthy asset owners, people who hold gold, real estate, stocks, bonds, and other appreciating assets saw their net worth skyrocket while the wages of the working class are chewed up by inflation. So the answer to that, of course, is to stop printing money and start creating the stuff money buys. Build more houses, grow more nutritious food, build pipelines to bring Canadian energy to Canadian consumers. That way we actually produce the things that dollars buy and thereby increase the value of our dollar relative to the goods we need to purchase. So we're going to have to get spending back to normal pre-COVID levels as quickly as possible. Bring in a pay-as-you-go law to ensure that every new dollar of unbudgeted spending is met with a dollar of savings, and unleash the free enterprise system so businesses and farmers can make more here in Canada.
We heard Justin Trudeau say that he doesn't think about monetary policy, and the answer...
I believe him. Who doesn't believe him? Like, I don't believe a lot of things he says. That one I believe.
What I found more interesting than that was what he said in response, or to justify it. He said, "I don't think about monetary policy. I think of families." When I'm thinking, well, hang on, how does monetary policy not affect families? But there is a question in that, though, which is that do you think Canadians understand and care about these inflationary issues you're bringing up? Because again, it does get in the weeds, and a lot of Canadians are thinking, cut the nonsense. What's it going to mean for me? But do you find that is a discussion that is taking place in Canadian households?
Oh, it's taking place in shopping aisles. It's taking place in home showings with real estate agents. It's taking place at the gas station when people are filling up their cars. And that's why this deficit issue has gone from the abstract to the highly vivid and practical. People are actually witnessing what deficits do to their cost of living. Whereas, a few years ago it was an abstraction. The consequences were not yet visible. Now people see what it's doing to their lives. It's chewing up their dollars in the present. So there's no doubt people make the link between overspending and inflation. They live it, they see it, they feel it. And the fact, I think one of the reasons why Trudeau's in free fall in the polls and why Conservatives are gaining is because people know that if Trudeau's reelected, there will be a continued explosion in inflation and a cost of living crisis.
You mentioned earlier that this election you think is about Trudeau seeking a majority. He's had relatively unchecked power with the NDP and the Bloc backing him for the last couple of years. But realistically, what do you think the consequences of a Trudeau Liberal majority would be?
A massive debt crisis. Right now, Canada has about $8.7 trillion of debt, personal, corporate, and government debt combined. That means we have $4 of debt for every $1 of GDP. So a 1 percentage point increase in the effective interest rate on all debt in Canadian economy will cost $87 billion every year, 1 percentage point, or it will cost 4% of GDP. Just put that into perspective. Imagine 1 percentage point increase in the effective interest rate that we all pay on all our debts would cost 4% of GDP. At a federal level, a 1% just in debt, in terms of the federal debt, a 1% increase in interest rates means $12 billion in extra costs. That's much more than a 1 point increase in the GST. So, like, you start to think about the enormous costs that we're going to face when interest rates eventually rise. That problem will only worsen if we re-elect a prime minister who's determined to further indebt the nation. We will face a serious debt crisis, and that will bring a catastrophic human tragedy. So what we need to do is make a shift now away from a credit card economy to a paycheck economy, to unleash the productive forces of our economy, to make more, cost less, paychecks, not debt.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.